kind of unbelievable to me that there are people who will be watching this video who haven't subscribed to the channel. Because I was thinking about that before this started, and I couldn't believe how anybody could do something like that. So, I mean,
Yeah.
not just for channels generally, just for this particular channel. Other
Yeah, no,
channels, it's understandable. But
clearly everyone should subscribe. I mean, it's unbelievable that there's anybody who's not watching, you know?
yeah,
Like, what's the matter with these crazy people?
Yep.
yeah. In fact,
Strongly agree.
if you haven't watched the earlier videos, you should stop watching this and go watch the earlier videos first. But the question we're trying to answer today is, what is the right theory of property rights? And naturally, we have two different philosophers with two different answers to this question. So, I mean, everybody knows Michael Huemer, but we're also joined by Dr. Jesse Spafford, who's a philosophy lecturer at Victoria University of Wellington. So, I guess, Dr. Spafford, you introduce yourself first, and then we'll go to Michael Huemer.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Jesse, Jesse Spafford. Like you said, I'm based at the Victoria University of Wellington down in New Zealand. Yeah, and I'm a political philosopher doing work on a variety of questions, but primarily interested in anarchism and particularly interested in left-wing anarchism, arguing for an egalitarian version of anarchism as a moral view is my angle. But I have some other interests. I'm interested in rights. I'm interested in sort of theories of rights, rights forfeiture, questions like that, self-defense, those sorts of questions.
Okay, and then we had Huemer in the first episode, and he's back now. Michael Huemer.
Yeah, so I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of Colorado at Boulder. I've written about epistemology, ethics, political philosophy. I have a book called "The Problem of Political Authority" that everybody should immediately buy and read. My most popular political philosophy work, and I've written about 12 books that you should also buy, all of them.
Yeah. A lot of people were losing sleep over whether they were brains in vats. So if you're struggling with that question, you have to watch the first video. But even more, considerably more people are losing sleep over whether they have a right to their own property. So okay, so yeah, we're just gonna do it like this. We're gonna have Michael Huemer is gonna start with his opening. Jesse's gonna start with his opening. Then they're going to have a bit of a rebuttal, and then we're just gonna go into open discussion. So I guess we can get started now.
Okay, good. So I guess I'll just say some things about what property rights are, I guess. So there's an institution in our society called property rights. And the core of this is that items of value get assigned to a particular person who has the right to decide which of the otherwise morally acceptable uses of the property of the resource shall be realized or attempted. Okay, and I got that characterization from Robert Nozick. So there's a collection of sort of ancillary rights that you get if you own something, like, oh, you can bequeath it, and you can give people permission or deny people permission to use it, and you can destroy it, if you want, stuff like that. But the core thing is you get to decide which of the acceptable uses is realized. And the reason for this is, well, there are resources, there are valuable things in the world that in order to get value out of them, somebody has to do something with them, but there are different ways that different people would like to use them that are incompatible. And so there has to be a solution to this potential conflict. Okay. And the property rights solution is, for each of these items, there's a particular decision maker. And then what that decision maker decides is what happens. Okay. And now there's potentially a moral problem with this, which is, when you own property, then you get to exclude other people from making use of that property, which on the face of it is harmful to the other people. Okay, so you have something of value and you could decide to not use it in a valuable way. And simultaneously, you could decide to exclude other people from getting value out of it, which seems bad. Okay, so you might want to wonder, like, why should we have an institution that lets you do that? You might say, we are usually not allowed to harm other people. It looks on the face of it like it's harmful if I stop somebody from using a valuable resource that they could otherwise use, right? Okay, good. Now, so why should we believe in property rights at all? And so I have a couple of things to say about that. One is an appeal to intuitions. So most people will have a moral intuition that's along the lines of natural property rights. So, like, let's say there's a hermit living in an area that is outside the jurisdiction of any government. All right, maybe this is on an island that was not discovered for a while, and so there's no government in operation. And the point of this stipulation is to ensure that your intuitions will not be influenced by the law of a particular society. Okay, so there's the hermit, and also it's a hermit because there are no social conventions that he's a part of. All right, but so you go to this area, maybe you go to this this island that is outside the jurisdiction of any government, and you find this hermit there who's living by himself, and then he has some stuff. There's some stuff that he's making use of, like he built a hut, and he's got a spear that he uses for hunting or whatever. Okay, and now, would it be okay for you to go and just do whatever you want with this stuff? Which I'm inclined to call his stuff, but that might be a tendentious description, okay? Like you have the hut and you can just like paint it lime green because you feel like it. Or, there's this spear that he made and you could just take it. And then, you could just take a bunch of the stuff that he's accumulated with you as you leave the island. You could destroy some of the stuff, whatever, rearrange or whatever. Okay, would these be okay things to do? And then I think you probably have the intuition that these things are not okay. All right, and now, but these things would be okay if you just found these things and it wasn't created by the hermit, or if you'd made the spear, then you could take it with you. That would be okay. And so it does look like there's something like property rights involved there. All right, and this is natural property rights, meaning not created by conventions or laws. And that was the point of stipulating that it's a hermit who's outside the jurisdiction of the government. So it looks like there are moral constraints that we all that we intuitively accept. Now, that's not to say that every aspect of property is natural. So there are aspects of our property institutions that are created by convention and by the law. But I'm just saying there is some core that is not dependent on convention or law. Okay, so like, this is an example that I got from David Friedman, like, can American Airlines fly airplanes over your house? So you own the land and then you own some amount of the airspace above the land, but how high up, so can they fly an airplane that's like 100 feet above your house? Probably not. Can they fly 20,000 feet above your house? Probably yes. But how high they're allowed to fly is determined by conventions and laws. Okay, so that's not natural property rights. So I think there is a core intuitive kind of natural notion of property rights, and then there are aspects of it that have to be specified by the conventions. Okay, so okay, so you're supposed to think that there's just sort of like an ethical intuition, and then you should just accept what seems intuitive unless you have specific reasons for doubting it. This is the other thing that I want to say about why we have an institution of property. There's sort of a rule utilitarian rationale. So the world contains these resources that can provide a lot of value, but only if somebody does something with them. Like there's some land and somebody could grow food on the land, right? But somebody has to do something to get this value out of the land. Okay, and there's potentially conflict about who gets to do something with the land. Okay, but if there are no conventions governing who gets to control the resource, then what will in fact happen is, well, maybe people will just fight over it, right? Or suppose that there's a convention that you're not allowed to fight with people. Then what will happen is that the first person who finds it will probably try to use it up. Okay, but there's a lot of stuff that would create value that will not happen if there aren't conventions or laws that protect property rights. So like, I'm not going to create a farm on some land if I'm not secure that I will get the benefit. So if there are no property rights institutions, then what will happen is I plant the crops, and then as soon as they're ready, 50 other people will come and take them, right? Because there's no rule to stop them from doing that. And if I know that that's going to happen, then I'm just not going to plant the crops. And then I'm just going to go and, maybe I would just have to be a hunter-gatherer. Everyone would have to be a hunter-gatherer, right? Okay, and that's just one example, and there are lots of things that are like that. Like I'm not going to build an apartment building if I can't control who lives in it, So if there's no property institutions, then I guess anybody can just come and start living in it, and I can't exclude them. And if I can't exclude them, that means that I can't charge people money, because the way that I charge people money is that I threaten to exclude them unless they pay me rent. Okay. So then if I can't charge people money, then I'm not going to make an apartment building. And that's just true about lots of things, like this computer that I'm using wouldn't exist. If the people who made it couldn't count on getting most of the benefit from making it, right? Okay. So, and then you think, okay, yeah, what are the possible solutions to the potential conflict over resources? You think, okay, so here's a possible solution. We fight over resources. That's what happens if you don't have any other rule. Okay. And what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that is only the best fighters get goods, and people who are not good at fighting don't get anything. And then that's really bad. And then, there's just like enormous harm when like two people are not sure who's the better fighter, and then they fight it out to find out. And then there's enormous harm that occurs that is, maybe greater than the value of the goods that they're fighting over. And then you have the problem that a lot fewer goods get made because, people who are not good at fighting don't make any goods because they're not going to get to keep them. This is a quotation from David Friedman, the economist and anarcho-capitalist. The direct use of physical force is so poor a solution to the problem of limited resources that it is commonly employed only by small children and great nations. Okay, this is another rule. Anybody gets to use any resource they see whenever they want, but you're not allowed to fight with other people. So that gets rid of some of the problems of the first solution. But there's going to be this problem of you don't want to expend a lot of time and effort to create something of value, because like after you create it, like you have to use it immediately or somebody else will use it. There's a problem of the tragedy of the commons, which is there might be some resources that have to be husbanded, in a certain way to maintain their value, and nobody's going to do that, because other people are going to take it. There's another solution. Maybe we could have it that whenever there's a conflict as to what to do with some resource, we vote on it. Okay, and what's the problem with that? There's going to be like huge transaction costs, right? And then there's just some general problems with democracy in general. Like you have a lot of uninformed voters, and like people will not be prepared to vote wisely. It's just not going to work out. This is not really feasible. Here's another possibility. People take turns using each particular resource. Okay, that's not going to be good because the thing is going to be used up like by the first couple of people. Like if there's an apple tree, then the first person whose turn it is will just take all the apples, or they'll eat as much as they can. And again, people will not actually create things of value. Okay, here's another possibility. You have a society in which everyone is a utilitarian and everyone just agrees to do the utility maximizing use for each resource. The only problem is that this isn't feasible with real people. Also, by the way, even if everyone was a utilitarian, they wouldn't agree on what the utility maximizing use is, right? Even utilitarians don't agree with each other on what maximizes utility. Okay, and then here's the last solution. You could have each good assigned to a particular person who's the decision maker for what gets done with that good. And this is the only solution I can think of that's not obviously horrible. This is the property rights solution. Now, there are disagreements. So I think this is a solution of every society. Every society has a version of the property rights solution. There are disagreements about who should own the property. So there are some societies in which like the state owns a lot more of the property, like socialist or communist societies. But I don't think there's really a disagreement about the basic solution that there should be somebody who's the decision maker. Okay, and there could be qualifications, like you don't get complete decision control. You don't get to decide among just anything that could be owned. So there could be restrictions on what you're allowed to do with the property, but there's still within certain constraints. There's generally a decision maker. Okay, and so that's the essence of property rights. As far as I can tell, there isn't a feasible alternative solution. Right. And so, on general rule utilitarian grounds, we should respect property rights. All right. That's my spiel.
Yeah, great. So I'll try to briefly make the case against property rights, against the existence of natural property rights, which, Mike has helpfully sort of outlined for us, right? Sort of emphasized that property is a bundle of rights, right? We might think that typically if you own something in a moral sense, right, you have claims against other people using it without your permission. You have the power to waive those claims, to transfer those claims. You have permissions to use the thing as you'd like. And also we might think that you have the permission to coercively enforce these rights. There's some question about whether or not that's just sort of a necessary feature of having a right, whether rights are sort of by definition coercively enforceable. I'll sort of set that aside for now. And basically, I think there are some persuasive reasons for thinking that people do not have at least many of the rights in this purported bundle. And I'll give a couple. So the first worry I have is about the permission to coercively enforce these rights, right? So one issue with private property is that, if you have these rights, you can coercively enforce them. You can stop people from using your stuff, using force. And in my view, and I think in Mike's view, coercion, there's a pretty high standards of justification that have to be met if you're going to permissibly coerce anybody. There's sort of coercion is, at least prima facie wrong. And so there's a question of, and so the thought is if you're then coercively enforcing property rights, then you need to justify that. And my worry is that many of the purported justifications for this coercion don't work. So let me sort of start by trying to illustrate why we might think that coercive enforcement of property rights is at least sort of troubling intuitively, So I think there's various cases that might illustrate this, right? So suppose, one case I give is suppose that we're all on a cruise ship, we're cruising around, and we come upon some, previously undiscovered islands, right? Nobody owns them, nobody's ever been there before, nobody's seen them, nobody knew they existed, and the cruise ship sort of pulls up and, gets to the island, the gangplank goes down. Everybody's excited. They say, oh, wow, we can't wait to go on the island and explore. This will be so fun. But I run onto the island first and I say, this is mine. I've claimed this. This is actually Jesse's island now. And I forbid you all from going on the island. And anybody who comes on, I'm going to forcibly remove you. And obviously, you're probably not going to be happy about this. You're going to say, hey, who made you the boss, right? Why do you get to decide who uses the island? And I say, well, I found it. Tough. Finders keepers, right? And then you say, well, whatever. And you come on the island. And then I tie you up and I sort of forcibly remove you. I spray some sunscreen in your eyes and force you back on the boat. I think intuitively it seems like I've done something wrong here. And so then the thought is, well, I've coerced you. And then the thought is, well, this coercion needs to be justified, right? What could justify this coercion? Because, right, this is the same thing that at least property owners do all the time, at least tacitly or via the state, right? To sort of have, right, when they enforce their property claims, they're using coercion against people. So the thought is, if you really have private property, there must be something special about that justifies this coercion. And basically, I just think that most of the purported justifications for this coercion don't work. So I have a bunch that I consider, which we can get into if we want. But maybe I'll just give a quick example, right? So I think one very plausible justification is one that Mike sort of offered in his, at least in his opening remarks, which is that private property really delivers the goods, right? If you allow people to sort of do this kind of coercive enforcement, then that actually makes us all better off, right? We're all much richer, right? If we didn't have private property, the world would be poor and miserable. It'd be a sort of a Hobbesian type state of nature in many ways, at least with respect to natural resources. It would be a mess. But the thing is, I worry that actually the fact that sort of coercion would leave everybody better off doesn't seem to actually justify coercion. And I think there's a lot of intuitive cases that sort of draw this out. So, for example, suppose that I'm working at the Sneaku ad agency, and I have an idea for an advertisement that's going to really make our company succeed and thrive. Nobody else recognizes this, right? You all have really bad ideas about what would make for a good advertisement that's going to make our company go bankrupt. So I pull out a gun and I say, hey, right, you have to do it. You have to make my ad or else, right? We might think, well, this act of coercion leaves everybody better off. It leaves me better off. It leaves you all much better off than if our company closed down. But I think intuitively, it still seems like I acted permissibly in this case. And I think that sort of seems to show that the provision of benefits, the fact that you're leaving people much better off, doesn't necessarily justify coercion. And so then I would worry the same thing would apply to property rights. And I think sort of similar arguments can be given against a number of purported justifications for private property. Okay, so that's one sort of quick argument. A second argument is maybe slightly more abstract, and it's a worry about sort of state legitimacy in general and how worries about state legitimacy actually might apply to private property. So very quickly, I know I'm probably approaching 10 minutes, but the worry is that, right, when people worry about state legitimacy, they worry about whether or not the state has the power to oblige, right? Can the state sort of make us obligated to obey its laws? Can it sort of give us a duty to obey the law just by issuing edicts? And I think many people, including me, and I presume Mike, say, no, the state does not have that power. And I think that it's, you might think, well, why? Why doesn't the state have this power? And my answer to this question is because there's a particular thing that would justify the state having this power, but states just don't, in practice, ever meet this condition. And specifically, I think it's only plausible to think that the state or anybody has the power to oblige you by issuing edicts if you've agreed to obey them, right? If you promised them that you'll follow their orders, then the state sort of, then they or the state does have the power to oblige you. But if you've never actually consented to this, if you've never actually promised the state that you'll do this, then it doesn't have the power to oblige you. So that's my view. And in practice, states and other people generally don't have your consent. But what I want to suggest is that if you have private property rights, then you actually have the exact same power to bind people by issuing edicts as a legitimate state, right? So if I own some bit of land, I can say, you can come on this patch of land only if, say, you wear exclusively red, right? If you have to wear an all red outfit to come on this bit of land. That's sort of a rule I can make with respect to my little patch of land. And you then wrong me if you come on my land and say, don't wear red, right? So it seems like to have property rights is to be able to make binding moral rules over a patch of land. But I want to say this is just the same power that legitimate states claim when they say they're legitimate, right? They say, yeah, within our territory, we can make these rules that are binding such that you wrong the state if you fail to comply with them. But what I want to say is states have this power only if you consent to them having this power. And the same thing goes for private individuals, right? So to have those moral powers associated with private property, I want to say you have to have gotten the consent of everybody out there, right? If you want to bind them, if you want to be able to issue these sort of morally binding edicts with respect to some patch of territory, you have to get people's consent. But obviously, nobody's actually consented to the acquisition of most private property. So therefore, people don't actually have private property rights over land.
So I think there's a general intuition about property rights. Now, so I think Jesse's view was that in general, if you coerce someone, you require some strong justification for that, which I agree with. But I think that what counts as justification is sort of, determined by our ethical intuition. So it's not always consent. Right? So you can get justification for coercing somebody by consent. Like if you're in a boxing match, you're allowed to punch the other person in the face because they consented by getting in a boxing match. Okay. But it doesn't have to be that. So, most people also think that you can coerce somebody if doing so is necessary to prevent them from doing some wrongful action, or from coercing another person. You can also have cases where like somebody owes a person, let's say somebody owes another person compensation, and that's going to be enforced coercively, right? So like person A sues person B in court and wins, and then, B still doesn't want to pay the money, and then the government forces them to pay. Okay, so like there could be different justifications for coercion, and what counts as a legitimate justification is sort of determined by our ethical intuitions. Now, and so I think most people would have the ethical intuition that it is permissible to use coercion to protect your property. And of course, there are limits, like you can't just kill somebody because they got on your land, but you can like push them off your land or something like that. Okay, now you might say, so why doesn't this work for just defending government authority, which I deny, right? So, why can't somebody just say, we have an intuition that the government has authority over other people? I think basically the answer is that we don't. So when I give this, I give this story about a person who is acting like a government, where the person decides to go around collecting taxes and, giving money to poor and like telling people what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. So almost everyone has an intuition that that is wrong, unacceptable behavior. And almost everybody sees the analogy to government, like what I'm describing this person doing is like what the government does. And then when I ask, so why is it okay for the government to do it? Like nobody's response is, it's just intuitive. It doesn't need any explanation, right? Like everybody sees the point. Everyone sees that it needs an explanation. Okay, now it is very widely held that the government is entitled to do these things. And so people sort of struggle to find the explanation for why they're allowed to do these things. So like in some sense, you might say it's intuitive to people that the state has authority, but at the same time, most people recognize that you do need a further explanation. Like it's not just a basic fact that this 535 people in Washington have authority over the rest of us. There's got to be something about them. And then when you look at the explanation that people give for what about them is special, then they don't hold up. Okay, now, when it comes to property, I think, I don't think it's implausible to say, no, this is just like it's just a fundamental thing. Like one of the fundamental exceptions to the rule against coercion is if coercion is necessary to protect your property. But the other thing that I want to say about it is the rule utilitarian rationale. That look, if we don't have this, things are going to go badly. I have a general sympathy for rule utilitarianism. And okay, so Jesse gave another example. The example where you're working for an advertising agency and like I think this came from my book actually. You've thought of a good plan for your company to do, and the other people are not agreeing with it, so you're just going to force them to go along with it. Okay, and like how is this different? I mean, one thing is, I don't know, you're kind of actually violating the other people's property rights when you're doing that. But the other thing I wanted to say is, okay, like I don't think that this comes out okay on rule utilitarianism, right? Although there is sort of like a question about at what level of generality you have to state the rules, okay? But I think it's going to be that like the beneficial social rules are not going to allow you to do that. But the most beneficial social rules are going to allow there to be a general institution of property rights. And so like for the reasons that I described previously, I just think society is going to fall apart if you don't have an institution of property. Right. But like nothing bad is going to happen if you have a prohibition on forcing people at your company to go along with your plan. Actually, that's probably going to be good in general. Yeah. So that's my thing.
Okay, great. So yeah, I guess maybe I'll focus on the initial statement that you did, Mike, and then maybe I'll get to the rebuttal. We'll see. So I guess what I would want to say, is I guess I'll start with I want to start with your hermit case, right? So, I mean, I guess a lot of maybe our disagreement could hinge on like what intuitions people have. So I guess we'll really have to get into like what intuitions do we have and what explains them, et cetera. I guess you've kind of tried to give something of I guess maybe not quite a debunking explanation of my intuitions, but you at least want to say, well, I've given some intuitions, sort of some intuitive worries about property. And you're like, well, but we have a lot of intuitive sort of reasons for thinking people do have property. And you gave the hermit case in your initial statement. I guess my worry about that case is that I feel like there are other potential explanations of why we might think, because I agree, I share the intuition that it would be wrong to, go and take the hermit stuff. But I worry that there are other explanations of that intuition besides the fact that the hermit has property rights vis-a-vis those things. Right. So one thing that I want to suggest and that I sort of defend elsewhere is that I want to say, well, in the absence of property rights, what should govern the permissible use of resources? And what I want to say is that resources should be governed in an egalitarian fashion, such that we do have, in my view, rights vis-a-vis resources, and we have claims against other people using resources, but they're egalitarian claims. So you have claims against people using resources in ways that roughly would leave you worse off through no fault of your own. We're wealthy tourists coming in on, presumably a big fancy boat, and now we're making things even worse for them, right? We're sort of exacerbating an inequality. And what I want to say is, that seems wrong, and that's why it seems like we wrong the hermit when we take their stuff. By contrast, right, if you imagine things very differently, if you imagine the hermit is sort of a very sort of super wealthy person and you're a poor refugee who's just washed up on shore, right? You're starving, right? You've got nothing. You're just like, a castaway on a raft. Well, now I don't think it seems so counterintuitive that you can, start eating the coconuts on the island. And I think if they came out and said, sorry, those are my coconuts, you can't have them, right? Or, you can't sort of take shelter here. This is my island. This is my house. I think that starts to seem less plausible. So I want to say there's actually a debunking explanation here. I don't think that the Sneaku case is that different from, the sort of rule utilitarian case that Mike is making for property rights. And I think a lot of this is going to come down to the generality of the rules, because Mike's right that, a rule that, the rule nobody can sort of, violently assault their coworkers is probably a good rule. But seemingly the best rule is that nobody can violently sort of menace their coworkers with a gun, except in this one case where they're about to make a really disastrous decision that's going to that's going to bankrupt the company, and well, you'll save the day, right? It seems like that's a better rule. Uh, and so, in some sense, I think that the person in Mike Sneaku case is sort of following the optimal rule. They're doing the best possible thing, for society. They're following the best possible rule to a T, and yet it doesn't seem permissible. So I actually do think that the analogy persists here. Yeah, and then I guess the one final thing I'll say is that I do think Mike sort of challenged the sort of symmetry between property and authority, right? And wanted to say, well, look, it seems like people don't have the intuition that authority is justified, that states are legitimate, right? They do think that that is something that needs to be justified sort of as a default. And that's why, he appeals to more fundamental, sort of more primal, I guess, intuitions that we have about, your neighbor running around and taxing you and trying to lock you up if you smoke marijuana or whatever. But I think the same thing is true of property rights, right? Like, and in some sense, I think my island case sort of illustrates that, right? That, we, I think, take for granted, property rights as sort of a natural institution in just the same way that we take for granted the state. But I think once we sort of demystify these things and we try to put them in more sort of, pedestrian terms and recreate analogous everyday scenarios, I think in both cases, the intuition that these sorts of the coercion of the state and the coercion of private property owners, I think both start to seem suspect once we kind of make them, strip away the mystifications that we're sort of socialized into. So I do actually think there's a deeper symmetry there. So that would be what I would say in response to that point.
Yeah, so one of my examples with a hermit is you paint his hut lime green. And the point of that example is it's not tangibly harmful to him, but you still can't do that, right? And so the idea was that this is not explained just by a norm against harming people. Or, another variant is you go to the island and the hermit has made a spear and also you make a spear. You can take the one that you made with you, and you can't take the one that he made with you, even though the effect on him is the same, right? Like, if you'd made the spear and you take it with you, it has the same effect on him. Now he can't use that spear. If he made the spear and you take it with him, now he can't use that spear, right? So it's not really explained by harm unless you have a notion of harm that's sort of infected with your beliefs about the person's property. Right?
Interesting. So I like the spear case. Can I jump in? Yeah. I still wonder if it does maybe the work you want. So let's say we reimagine the case slightly, such that, like, I've made a spear, he's made a spear. They're exactly identical. They're like sort of perfect replicas. And now, but imagine now they're sort of like they get put in a closet and they get kind of shuffled up, right? And now I sort of take away, and I take his spear by accident, leaving the other spear behind. It seems like on your view, you're gonna have to say, I've actually done something pretty wrong. Like I've wronged him here, intuitively. But intuitively to me, I'm not sure about that, right? To me, it seems like, well, if they're really truly qualitatively identical spears, it actually does seem like a matter of indifference, at least intuitively to me, which spear I take. So I am actually maybe not sure that this case is going to sort of work in favor of the theory of property rights.
I mean, if there's no way of knowing, and neither of you know which one was made by him, then I guess it's permissible to take either one. But yeah, but well, this isn't a likely scenario, but it is likely to have two spears that are distinguishable, and they're about equally good. And then you have to take the one that you made. Or, I mean, the other variant on it is there's just one spear, and either it was made by you or it was made by him, and that determines whether you're allowed to take it with you. All right, so like if you take the one spear with you, then he doesn't have any spear to hunt with. But if you had made it in the first place, then it's okay to do that.
Yeah, but but there I worry that I think the egalitarian intuitions will both sort of function as, both a debunking explanation and maybe a potential counterexample, right? So, suppose that it is the only spear that he has to hunt with, and I just take it with me for fun. I take it back to, civilization, back to New Zealand. I think in that case, most people would think that I'm doing something wrong, and that, even though I made it.
I mean, maybe you made it specifically for the purpose of taking it back with you, and then you can't take it back. But I mean, you're kind of sort of like mixing in other considerations because,
Mhm.
oh, well, maybe you have a humanitarian obligation to give assistance to this person, right? But why are we supposing that you and the other person are in different circumstances, right? Like maybe you and he have exactly as much need for that spear, okay? But if you're the one who made it, then you get to take it, and if he's the one who made it, then he gets to take it, right?
Yeah, right. So I do think, yeah. So I admit that like I'm complicating things because I am positing this sort of auxiliary theory, right? And so, that sort of does make it a little bit harder to sort of it complicates the intuitive judgment because we sort of have to imagine like you know the world on one theory and the world on the other theory. Uh, I guess what I would say is that I do think that the more I agree that there's going to be some intuitions that are going to sort of run contrary to my theory. Like I think there's going to be intuitions that sort of cut against both theories, right? So like I think the identical spear case sort of cuts against the theory of property. But I do think that your point is like I think many people would have the intuition that if there's only one spear, it goes to whoever made the spear. But even then, I think I can offer a pretty good egalitarian debunking explanation of that intuition, right? So I can say, well, look, the reason that people have that intuition is because making things takes work. Presumably, it was costly to make the spear, right? And so then, if I made the spear, well, I've now incurred this cost. If you now take it, well, that's going to create an inequality, even assuming that all else is equal, right? Assuming we would get equal benefit from the spear, right? We might think, well, yeah, an inequality has been generated here, and that I can use that to explain why it seems impermissible to take things that other people made. Um, right. By
Uh,
contrast,
well,
if I loved making the spear and I had a great time doing it, well, then I think then I think the intuitions start to become much less clear that it's the wrong thing for you to take it if say we would both equally benefit from the spear, something like that. Though it also I think
right.
this intuition is very murky just because it's a weird case for at least in my view because when you have like sort of non-divisible goods and like how they should be like if you can't sort of have an equal distribution, then I think it's sort of unclear how you resolve that. Yeah, right. So I think in cases of not if in cases of non-divisible goods, then my sort of egalitarian theory gets like pretty it's sort of I don't think it has a determinate answer about what to do in those cases. So I don't really know what exactly I want to say about if there's only one spear and only one of us can get it. I don't know. Then maybe finders keepers or like makers is sort of like a tiebreaker. I'm not sure, but I don't think that's going to establish that people sort of have the kind of property rights that I think you want to posit.
Yeah. So I'm not sure why taking the spear that the other person made creates an inequality. I mean, what if I just like wasted a bunch of time doing nothing and you spend the same amount of time making a spear and then I take the spear. So then we both have sort of like the same total welfare apart from the spear, right? So, um,
Yeah, great. So, I mean, in some sense, this is why I think that and again, this is sort of maybe unfairly leaning heavily on my theory, right? But I want to say like the keys that, in my view, the rights that you're going to have aren't going to just be sort of strictly egalitarian rights. They're going to be luck egalitarian rights, right? So in some sense, like what you've given, I think, is sort of the classic motivating example that like luck egalitarians are motivated by, which is like, yeah, if you're just lazing around all day and then I'm working hard and like produce a bunch of stuff, then a luck egalitarian is going to say, yeah, you don't distribute the goods equally, right? That actually would be unfair and objectionable, right? You sort of ending up worse off is in some sense your own fault. You've made a kind of sanctionable choice that justifies an inequality. And so again, I think that the sort of the animating thoughts about who gets to use the resources, like I totally agree with your case. If you're just lounging around, I'm doing all the work. We shouldn't split the resources equally. But I'm like, that's actually a luck egalitarian intuition, not sort of a propertarian intuition, is what I would want to say.
right. I mean, so yeah, I wasn't imagining that I was sitting around doing nothing. I was doing some work that didn't produce a benefit. Yeah.
We're sort of assuming you're guiltless here, right? Is kind of the thought is that
Yeah. So one
you're trying your
possibility is
best,
I was doing some work that I thought was going to be useful, but it wasn't.
right?
And you were doing some work that actually was useful.
And we maybe assume that you're maybe I think to make this a good case, like we'd want it to be that you're justified in believing this, right? So you're not being negligent, right? You followed your best evidence. You really thought this was going to pan out, and then just kind of through bad luck, it didn't.
Yeah.
Something like that. Yeah. So I think in that case, yes. So basically, what I want to say is that the right. What I want to say is that in that case, it does actually seem to me again like the intuitions start to get much murkier, right? If I'm really trying my best to do something, or I guess you're trying your best to do something, but it just doesn't work out as a matter of bad luck, then it does kind of seem to me like resources should be split equally in that case, right? So suppose I produce a bunch of food, we both grow a crop. Your crop just doesn't pan out because of a bad weather conditions, right? You thought it would grow really well. It doesn't grow really well because of just bad luck. Mine grows really well. It does seem to me like, you wouldn't be doing anything wrong if you sort of ate half of my crop. I don't know. Maybe you don't share that intuition.
Yeah. I guess I think that most people would be on my side on that. But okay, but I think you can sort of like get it mixed up if you're suggesting that the person is going to literally starve. Like if you're literally going to starve, then you're entitled to take some food to keep yourself alive, which you wouldn't ordinarily be entitled to.
Yeah, right. So I do think it needs to be right. Yeah, I agree that if it's sort of starvation cases like that, maybe skews our intuitions. So I do kind of think that the case would be like, yeah, say it's just going to be, there's just going to be an inequality generated.
So, like, yeah, here's an example. Like, you and I are both investing in the stock market, and I picked a stock that went up, and you picked one that went down, and we were equally diligent in, doing our research, or whatever. Well, I get the money, and you take the loss.
Right. So, but then I guess like, the question then is like, would that justify, the sort of associated coercion, right? Like, so I mean, like what I'd ideally like to come up with is, I feel like the good case would be one where we sort of imagine that, yeah, sort of there's a luck-based differential, and then one person, that sort of, does that justify sort of one person then coercively excluding the other person from resources, right? So, yeah, say we both grow crops, yours grows a bit, you're like, okay, but mine grows really well through sort of pure luck. And then you sort of come over and try to, help. You're like, well, look, I'm sort of hungry. Like I'm doing okay. I'm not going to starve to death, but I'm like sort of hungry. Meanwhile, I'm just sort of living the best life possible. Right. And I say, sorry, you can't like, if you come on and you try to eat my peanuts, like, I'm going to lock you up. Right. I'm going to tie you up and sort of, tie you to this tree. Right. To me, that starts to seem like I'm maybe wronging you. And I think that the intuition that it wouldn't be permissible to sort of enforce my rights in that case would be, can be sort of explained by, I think my egalitarian theory of rights sort of explains that intuition. Well, I feel like the propertarian sort of answer gives the property rights theory gives the wrong answer in that case.
Yeah, I would have thought it was intuitive that whichever one of us had the better food can't exclude the other one. So like I can't injure you. I shouldn't injure you, but I could push you off the land to stop you from getting the food. I guess I think that is intuitive. Maybe there's a difference in intuitions between left wing and right wing people. But I don't think that this is like particularly extreme. Like I think I have the mainstream intuition, although I have not done a survey on this. Yeah.
Yeah, that's. I mean, that's fair, and I guess I do feel some pull of the intuition. I guess what I would say is I feel like the question is right. I think when we sort of I guess maybe the test would be like, I think if we holistically consider, I guess what I'd say is the test would be if we holistically consider sort of the broad scope of intuitions, right? I think in some sense we'd want to do something like reflective equilibrium, where there's questions of what intuitions do we have about this range of cases, and what theoretical justifications can we offer for those intuitions, and sort of how well do they line up? So I guess sort of the skeptical challenge that I would raise against properties, at the very least, I want to say, look, I can give you some cases where property rights theories give you very counterintuitive results, right? Like my island case, I'd say like the identical spear case, basically cases where, there's a significant inequality between people if property rights are enforced. And then I can complement that with theoretical sort of supporting arguments, which is like, well, yeah, what is the justification? Why think that we have these property rights sort of beyond the raw intuitions, right? The intuitions are doing some work, but can we sort of give a general, adequately satisfying explanation about why people have these rights and why, say, given instances of coercion are permissible? Right? What makes coercion justifiable in these instances? And I think that's very hard to do. And so that sort of would be, I think, the thrust of my skeptical challenge would be like, yeah, counter intuitions and sort of the theoretical approach.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah. Maybe we should talk more about your example of the cruise ship coming to the island.
Yeah. Great.
To me, that's just a story about what could be the legitimate ways of acquiring property, rather than about whether property is legitimate in general. So, well, you don't acquire the whole island just by standing on the island and saying that it's yours before somebody else does. And and I don't think that you acquire the coconuts just by seeing them and then saying that they're yours, right? But so that's why, like in my example, the things that I ascribe the hermit property rights over are the things that he made, right? So he's not just taking some resource that was already there that had the same value and then saying that it's his. He's like, he's building the hut or something like that, which I think is a better case for owning property. And and I might agree with you that you don't get to own the stuff that's just like there in nature.
Yeah, great. So then, but I think that in some sense, maybe we could understand you doing is offering a justification. Like when I think people give like a theory of acquisition of property, in some sense, we might think that that's functioning as a justification for the property rights, right? So we might think, you might think, yeah, the reason that you're justified in coercing somebody is because you made this thing, right? And say the fact that you labored on this sort of justifies you then excluding it from them, right? Yeah, so you can't just claim things. That's not a suitable justification. But if I've labored on something, well, now there's sort of a justification there. But again, I'm like maybe a little skeptical that those kinds of justifications work as well, right? So sort of here's, I can give you my skeptical case quickly. So basically here's my worry so imagine that I have a car that I own, right? Grant me ownership rights, but now I give you permission to do a bunch of work on it, right? I say, okay, I'm waiving, or at least, I'm waiving my rights, my claims against you. And you sort of invest a bunch of labor, sort of modifying my car, painting it, renovating it, etc. And then I say, well, and then I drive off in it, right? And you say, hey, I did all this work on it, right? You're taking my work, my hard labor that I did. And then you sort of rip me out of the car and sort of, tie me up, right? I'd say, well, it seems like you acted wrongly. But what I'd say is that actually it seems like when you labor on unowned things, I actually think you're doing something totally analogous, right? So say there's some unowned thing, an unowned tree, and you start doing a bunch of work on it and modifying it and improving it. Well, the fact that it's unowned, that means that sort of I have a permission to use it, right? So we might think, yeah, well, basically what I'd say is in the car case, right, you have no complaint about me driving off with your labor because I have a permission to do that, right? It's sort of in virtue of the bundle of ownership rights I have over that car, those include permissions to use the car. So that when I then exercise those permissions, right, you have seemingly no basis for complaint about me driving off with your labor, even though you've done all this work on the car. But in some sense, I think the same thing is true of unowned things, right? If you do a bunch of labor on an unowned tree, and then I sort of say, take the tree and sort of carry off, whatever you've done with it, you've made a chair out of it, I carry off the chair. I think similarly, you have no basis for complaint because you knew going into it, right? When you did all this labor, you knew that I had this moral permission to use this thing. You did the labor anyway, right? And I think, well, yeah, in some sense, you knew I had the permission to do this. You have no complaint if I then exercise that permission. And I think that's sort of the theoretical debunking explanation I would get, or it's not a debunking explanation. That's a theoretical sort of argument I would raise against the idea that, say, like working on things justifies, coercively excluding people from them. Again, sorry, that got really choppy. Hopefully that came across.
Yeah, good. So, yeah, in the case where I work on your car, I mean, I think that I assume that I knew in advance that it was your car, and we didn't make any agreements about you losing any ownership or about you paying me. So then I would think that if I worked on the car anyway, then I was basically consenting to you having the value that resulted from that. Now, in the case where somebody acquires property rights by working on some land, well, the actual conventions of our society are such that the person who's working on the land, like they would not be agreeing to give the value to somebody else. They would be expecting to get the value for themselves because that's according to the conventions of our society, or even the laws.
Yeah,
Right.
good.
So
Right. Yes, I like that. I like that argument a lot. So, right. So maybe the thought is we think, yeah, there's sort of consent being given in the car case, but not in the land case. But then I wonder if maybe we can modify the car case such that we can sort of stipulate that consent isn't being given, right? So I say, you know, hey, like you can sort of modify, you can work on my car, and you say, okay, great, and you're like, but I don't want you driving off with it, right? Like this, I'm going to do all this work, and suppose I just kind of go like, he's being crazy. I don't know exactly how the case would work, but right, I kind of don't. I don't affirm. I don't lead you on or anything, but I kind of just like ignore you. Right? You say you write me a long note and you say I'm going to do a bunch of work on your car, but I don't. I refuse. You better not drive off with it, right? And take it after I do all this hard labor. Then you sort of slip it under my door, and then you do all this work, and then I drive off with the car. Right? So you're sort of explicitly not consenting. Still, seemingly, I don't think I wrong you when I do that, and I don't think, and I would wrong you, and you would wrong me if you sort of try to coercively stop me from using the car, I think. So I want to say that it's maybe not consent that's doing the work in this case. It is just the fact that you're doing labor on a thing that I have permissions to use. And so as a result, you're kind of, you're walking in with your eyes open, right? You know that I have the permission to do this. And so therefore you can't sort of coercively stop me from doing this thing just because you did work on the thing.
yeah. So okay. So yeah. You said, well, yeah, I knew going in that you had the permissions to use this thing, but
Mm-hmm.
in the case of somebody acquiring property, I mean, this doesn't really happen anymore. But I don't know. Back when people were homesteading land that was whatever unused, um, people would have been expecting to get to keep the land and the products that they got from it from doing the work on it, and like the social conventions would have backed them up on it. Yeah. And
Yeah.
like
I mean,
there
I think,
would have been a legitimate expectation, that other
okay,
people
right. So, but it seems like a
expected.
lot of weight is going to lean on legitimate, right? Because, again, we can modify the car case such that, wait, who's doing the work on the car? You're doing the work. Anyway, I'm doing
I'm
work on
doing
the
the
car.
work.
You're doing the
I
work on the
think I
car.
was working on your car, and I gave you this note that said, "I don't want you driving off
Okay, great.
afterwards." But in spite of
Good.
my giving
Yeah.
you that
Okay.
note, I still know that the rules of our
Yes. Thanks.
society
I appreciate
allow
you
you to
being,
drive off with it.
I appreciate you volunteering to be the person doing the deranged work on the car. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah. Right. So, again, suppose we could stipulate that you have expectations, right? You expect that you're going to keep the car after all this, right? You might think, I say you can use the car, and you think, okay, great. I know maybe you were just raised in a family with idiosyncratic conventions. I don't know. Again, it doesn't seem to me like that
Well,
changes anything. So
wait,
then we
do
might think, well,
you know that I
yeah,
have this expectation? Because I think
that's a
if
good
you do
question.
know, then it's wrong of you to give the permission without telling me that you don't plan to satisfy my expectations.
Yeah, that seems plausible to me, but I don't. Yeah, I would buy that, but I don't know if it would bear on the property case because in the property case, the permission isn't being sort of given by anyone. It's just sort of a natural permission. So yeah, I think I can grant that and be like, yeah, it would if I knew that you had these weird expectations and I sort of let you work on the car anyway, then yeah, maybe I'm doing something wrong there. Right. But yeah, suppose I don't know. Right. I waive the rights. You have this weird expectation. You labor on the car. Again, it still seems like your expectations aren't sort of doing the work because we might think that they're sort of maybe not legitimate. Right. It seems like legitimate expectations is going to be important. But then I worry that that's going to sort of just get into this. It's going to sort of become a little bit circular, right? Because it's like, well, the reason that your expectation isn't legitimate is because that's sort of just not how property rights work, right? Like I have a right to the car. You don't understand that. Like in some sense, you don't understand the moral fact is kind of what I think is going on there. But then I think you can't really appeal to legitimate expectations about property without getting into some kind of
Well,
circle. I'm not sure. I don't fully have a clear vision here, but that's kind of, yeah.
I mean, maybe the reason my expectation is illegitimate is that it's just contrary to the way things work in our society, and nobody gave me reason to think that it would work differently in this case.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess that's a move that you could make. I'm like a little bit skeptical just because I'm in some sense like, yeah, I mean, I have slight sort of skepticism about like the work that social conventions can do in terms of like making things morally binding upon people, right? So it's like, if you have the expectation that this is sort of how property work, like that if you do a bunch of work on a car, you kind of get to not keep it per se, but you get to sort of decide what's done with it. And a lot of other people just don't have that view and expectation. It's not clear to me that just adding a bunch of people, like if this is like, say this is how you've always done things with your family, right? You do, whoever does, you work on a thing, you get to kind of keep it effectively, right? And that's just not how anybody else does things. It's not clear to me that then, well, we have, that we all have the convention, right? And the idiosyncratic humor clan, right? That your expectation is not legitimate just because there's like fewer of you who do things this way, I guess would be my sort of
Yeah,
worry here.
what if there's a society in which when you do work on somebody's car, then you get to keep the car?
Mm.
And then and if that were publicly known, even if you don't agree with that convention, if you had then given me permission to do the work on the car, then I think you're giving up the car.
I mean, that seems right to me, but that sort of seems like if I know that and that's the convention, then it does start to seem like I'm consenting in that case. Yeah, so that seems right to me. But I think I can grant that while still sort of holding the force of the initial example and being like, yeah, right. It's one thing if I sort of, if there's a conventional signaling system and I sort of signal consent through that conventional signaling system, it does seem like I consent. But it seems like the issue in the case, the worry that I have about sort of the acquisition of private property is that there's not necessarily like an established, like nobody's consenting in that case, right? You're just sort of doing work on a thing that I have a default permission to use, right? And I don't give any sort of consent into to you sort of, to giving up any claims, any permissions that I have to use that thing, right? So that's sort of the thought where I'm like, well, yeah, then, as a result, if you then work on it, that's kind of just tough, right? You've lost your labor. You don't get to claim the thing in just the same way that, yeah, you working on the
Yeah.
car.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we should talk about the real utilitarian rationale, right? Because
Yeah, we've sort of run that into the ground, but it was interesting. Thanks.
yeah, so if this was the conventions of our society that you do some labor on some land, and that does not change your rights at all, and then other people can just like take the food that you grew, and they can live in the house that you built, stuff like that. This would be really bad. Like like we would not have a civilization if that was our convention.
Yeah, good. So, I mean, this is where I probably be the most concessive because in some sense, like what I'm most interested in is just, what sort of, I think there's separate questions for like what rights do people have vis-a-vis objects, and then there's sort of a practical question because in some sense I think what rights people have are going to actually be like hard to determine as a practical matter, right? So and I mean, in some sense I think almost any moral theory that sort of suffers from this problem. I mean, obviously, like utilitarians, as you note, suffer from this problem. Like just use the property in whatever the best way is. It's like, okay, well, what's the best way? I don't know. Right. So for utilitarians, right, there's like, just use the property in the best way possible. And it's like, okay, well, maybe that's right, but like, what do we do in practice? I don't know. Maybe property conventions are just the most practical way to do things. Maybe. Right. And in some sense, like I offer a sort of, and in some sense, we might think like, I mean, say you're a pure Nozikian, right? You're actually going to run into similar problems of like, oh yeah, the person with the rights over the thing is the person who sort of has this sort of unmolested chain of transfer, where nobody's ever sort of stolen or taken the thing. And it's like, okay, well, which of those things have that history? Again, good luck finding out. Right. So it's kind of like all, I think, moral theories sort of, or at least many of them suffer from this problem. And I sort of offer an account that sort of suffers from the same thing where I say, well, look, in my view, right, people should use resources in an egalitarian way, right? So you should use resources in whatever way sort of, gives people their fair share of utility, basically. What is that? I don't know. And in the absence of not knowing, I don't know, maybe something like property conventions is sort of, maybe that's the best we've got. Though at the very least, I then think that what I would the sort of thing that where I would be less concessive is that say, well, maybe property conventions are sort of pretty good, but there's probably things that, like, at least in my view, would be better, like property conventions with like a lot of egalitarian redistribution going on. So you're still not going to end up with sort of the kind of, like, I think, property rights that I think you might want to have. But I would still sort of concede, trying to actually like figure out, what egalitarian uses of things are is like impossible. So yeah, maybe some sort of, for practical purposes, maybe we have something like property, but still probably not like libertarian property, I think, is what I'd want to say here.
Right. Yeah. So there's sort of two debates to have, right? Like, should there be property right, period? And then should you take like the hardcore libertarian view of property, right? And I'm pretty hardcore, but that's sort of like harder to defend than just the idea that there should be some property. Yeah. So if you take a real utilitarian rationale, first thing I want to say is like, like the view that I'm entertaining, fairly sympathetic to, it would not be that it's just sort of like a compromise that we pretend that there are property rights or something. Like, the view would be that no, there are rights of a certain kind if the rules describing those rights are the best social rules. Like, right. So like, it is in fact correct because these rules would have the best consequences.
Yeah, that's fair.
And what else was I going to say? Oh yeah, okay. But if you take a real utilitarian rationale, then it's harder to defend a hardcore libertarian approach to property. It's easy to come up with ways that you could modify the rules, exceptions to the rules or restrictions on people's property rights that at least on the surface would appear to promote utility, and then I'd have to like make these arguments that they don't really promote utility. But like I do think that there's pretty good arguments for why most of the things the government does that interfere with property rights are actually harmful.
Right. I mean, which I think we have common ground there. So I guess, so I think this is a plausible line. Again, what I still would sort of press is that, so I mean, I guess in some sense, right, you want to say that rights are just like a function of whatever's going to sort of, whatever set of rules is going to kind of roughly maximize utility, something along those lines. Yeah. And I guess in some sense, I feel like that view is sort of much more proximate to my view than maybe like a standard libertarian entitlement theory. Right. Because in some sense, like, I want to say that, the rights we have over resources are just whatever sort of best promotes, in my view, like a luck egalitarian distribution of resources. So in some sense, there's sort of a parallelism here. So then that, I think, in a way leads to our sort of deeper debate being, well, it seems like there's sort of two tiers of debate. One is sort of like, what is the normative target we're aiming at, right? You're sort of appealing to a more utilitarian considerations, right? I'm appealing to more egalitarian considerations. And so I think there's maybe a deeper disagreement there. But we then maybe both kind of agree that maybe rights are sort of downstream from that, maybe. So maybe there's actually more commonality there than might have appeared at first glance. And then there's sort of a second question about like, what exactly are those rights? And I think in some sense you have a stronger case of like, my sort of rights assignments, like, we have at least pretty good reason for thinking that this promotes utility, right? We can sort of quibble about exactly which right schemes, like, how much sort of social democratic redistribution actually sort of is, utility maximizing. There's going to be a lot of empirical questions there, but at least like you're going to get something sort of market looking, I would say. And in some sense, for me, I have a much less of a clear answer. Like, mine probably doesn't look like property rights. Mine looks probably less like property rights, but I also like can't really tell you exactly how it looks because I do think it's largely indeterminate exactly which rights people have that would give them their sort of, in my view, fair share of utility.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I just care about the total utility. And I don't put any intrinsic value on equality of distribution. So, one person having 100 units and another person having 0 is equally good as two people having 50. Um,
Right. So
and
yes, there's going to be a deeper disagreement there. I don't know if that's maybe not like worth us getting into, because I feel like, I don't know. I mean, we could, but I feel like that's kind of, we've maybe have less distinctive things to say there.
That could go off on a long digression. I
Yeah.
have some other arguments about that, but they're sort of like going off on the side.
Right. Right. But yeah, so maybe we leave that there, but yeah, but I think that sort of is a nice, I feel like that nicely frames at least some of our disagreement. But also I do think maybe there's a little bit more convergence there than sort of the, it makes, okay, well, maybe to try to sort of reignite debate, right? I feel like that maybe makes your view look a little bit less sort of like what maybe natural rights libertarians like really want. Like, I don't know. I feel like a lot of sort of people who are otherwise very sympathetic to your arguments don't necessarily want property rights to sort of be held hostage to, the sort of, contingent facts about which set of rules, in fact, like maximizes utility. That may not trouble you, but I do think that's why that may not trouble you, but I do think that that's maybe is why I want to say maybe there's a little bit more convergence between our views than I maybe would have thought at first blush. Yeah, I don't know. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, like over time, I've become more sympathetic to rural utilitarianism.
I see.
Utilitarianism and rural utilitarianism in particular, and the reason for that, and I don't know what the correct moral theory is. The reason why I've become more sympathetic to rural utilitarianism is just sort of like it does a good job of accounting for my intuitions about a lot of cases. Like, it just like repeatedly happens that when I think about the rules that seem intuitive, I then can see why society will work better if those are the rules. And then I start to think like maybe there's a generalization here. Like maybe the correct rules are, in fact, maybe my intuitions are being somehow driven by what I just sort of sense about what would be good for society.
Would you be troubled if it, say, just turned out as a contingent empirical matter that, say, like sort of social democracy was the best sort of way of maximizing utility over, say, a more laissez-faire market system?
Then I would just sort of have a conflict right? Because like I just sort of have property rights intuitions, and then it might turn out that they're not explained by rural utilitarian considerations, and then I would have a sort of like conflict of judgments. Like some of my intuitions are explained by rural utilitarianism, and maybe if some of them are not, then I would have a question about whether I should be less sympathetic to utilitarianism, or whether I should change the intuitions that conflict with it. I wanted to make other comments, like because there are different versions of rural utilitarianism, and so like one version is so the right thing to do is the thing that accords with the rules that would in fact have the best consequences if everyone always correctly followed the rules. Okay. Yeah. Now, on that view, it looks like the correct rule is act utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism itself is a rule. If everybody correctly follows, does the action that maximizes utility every time, then that maximizes utility. Okay, and anyway, you don't want that result, and so the better form of rural utilitarianism is it's the rules that would have the best consequences if they were to be the conventional morality, right? Or if they were to be the rules that were socially accepted as the moral rules in your society.
So roughly, okay. Like if people believed, like in their head, just held this rule and were like, "I'm going to do this." That's sort of is that the thought?
Okay. Yeah, but it's got to be sort of like socially accepted. So like it's not that we're all privately thinking this, but that we know that this is the moral code of our country. Now notice that is different from everybody actually following it. So there could be a situation where there's a rule that's widely accepted, but that people don't in fact do what they're supposed to. Okay, so like it's widely thought that lying is wrong, but there's a lot of lying. Okay, so what matters is the consequences of the rule being socially accepted, which is not the same thing as it actually being followed.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, okay. I mean, this is an interesting view. I'd have to think a lot more about it. I don't know if I have anything particularly like I don't have immediate like objections or worries. I have questions, but
Oh,
yeah.
yeah. So, I mean, this was relevant to the example where the
Mhm.
person at the ad agency is going to force everyone to go along with his plan. That's good. Um, and, you might think, so it might be part of the example that this guy's plan is actually good. Okay. But if there was a social rule that says you get to force your coworkers to go along with your plan, if it's in fact the correct plan, like
Mhm.
if that's what the rule says, um, a lot of people are going to be doing it when it's not in fact the correct plan. Right. So a lot of people are going to think that they're going to think that they have the correct plan when they don't. And that's part of why this is not a good rule.
Yeah. Interesting. And so then the thought would be that would explain. So the thought would be that in the ad agency case, the problem is that they're violating the rule, and property rights acquisition sort of like doesn't violate the rule. That's sort of the thought.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Like, violating the beneficial rules. Like, so there could be a rule that,
Yeah.
that would allow you to force your coworkers, but this would be a socially harmful rule.
It's that's interesting. I mean, I still wonder if you could sort of cook up sort of act utilitarian type counter examples and be like, well, the rule is you don't force your coworkers to do stuff unless like you've got a really strong set of evidence that like meets all these different criteria, right? And such that you only coerce them in like, yeah, if imagine some set of like 5 rigorous tests have to be passed,
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Then I think, and then you might say, well, yeah, if everybody followed that rule, I don't know, maybe it sort of becomes an empirical question, but you might think, well, at least then maybe that's actually what would be utility maximizing. Like that would sort of allow for, really industrious act utilitarians to sort of deviate from the rules.
Yes.
Well, also like, but most people will be like, I can't, I'm not going to mess with this, something like that. And
Yeah.
then maybe in that case, you would have a case where the person's not violating the rule.
Yes.
Oh yeah, so maybe can we go like another? There's been a lot of interest. I don't know, maybe like another 10, 15 minutes. What's your time looking like, Michael?
Yep. Sounds good. I don't
I
have
mean, I
to
feel like
go in.
I feel like we've resolved a lot of, or at least like I feel like we've covered a lot of ground. So I don't feel like
Yeah.
there's necessarily too much more to really dig into. Well, obviously there's a lot, but
Yep.
I think we're reaching a natural conclusion, maybe. So yeah, why don't we keep chatting for a little bit and see where that takes us, and then
Yeah.
I'll maybe duck out. Yeah. So anyway, that would maybe be my. I like your rule utilitarian specification. I think that counters my initial point, but then yeah, that would maybe be my secondary sort of fallback objection.
Yes. Yeah. And like I do think that there's a utilitarian exception to most rules when there are sort of extreme consequences.
Mm-hmm.
If someone was going to die unless you force your coworkers to go along with this plan, then you can do it. And it might even be that actually, if the company is really going to go bankrupt and everyone is going to really very much be sorry, then it might be justified.
But do you want to say it's justified? I feel like you don't. I feel like you want to say it's not justified in this case. Isn't that what
um,
you want the Sneaku case to
I
show?
mean, yeah, I think in realistic circumstances, it's not justified. Um, there could be sufficiently severe consequences so that it would be justified. Um,
Yeah,
but
right. So it seems like we don't want to make the consequences too severe. We want it just to kind of be like life. Life goes a little bit better for everyone.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
particularly if we want to sort of preserve the analogy with the state, right? It's kind
yeah,
of, I feel like that would be a desideratum of the case is we want to preserve that
yeah,
analogy.
yeah. Good. Now, like rule utilitarians want to have some kind of limit on the complexity of the rules, and like hopefully this could be justified within the view, like by saying that there's a cost to having the set of rules be too complicated.
Mm-hmm.
So, like you have this rule which says, okay, you don't get to coerce people, but then there's this exception. But the exception is like really complicated, and it applies to cases that would almost never happen. Then, then it's not worth it to put the exception in there, right?
Right.
So
So
this is how we would want to rule out a lot of exceptions in sort of unlikely cases that philosophers come up with.
yeah, interesting. I'm a little suspicious of the move. I mean, because you'd want to say it has to be internally justified, right? Such that if you actually include these kinds of exceptions, that's like actually ends up being worse or something like that.
Yeah.
Or is it just like is this just an independent theoretical constraint that like the rules just shouldn't be so complex?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I was hoping that, you could appeal to the negative consequences of having overly complex rules. What are the problems? Like, it's harder for people to learn the rules. It's harder for people to even know that that's the rule.
Yeah.
And in the sorts of cases that philosophers will come up with, like, there'll be cases that would almost never happen or possibly have never happened, right? And so it's not worth complexifying the rules for these things that don't actually happen.
Okay, well, let me try. So I think that move, it's an interesting move. What if, but I wonder if maybe we can simplify this because, you've sort of given a pretty complicated debunking theory of this sort of Sneaku case to be like, yeah, I can say that, the Sneaku case is wrong, but maybe there are other cases. Yeah, but property sort of is not, property enforcement is not wrong in this way. But I guess I'm worried because it seems like what I think you would want to say, right, is it seems like you want to make a more general point, which is just that providing a lot of benefits isn't going to justify coercion, right? Isn't that sort of, because I feel like that's the deeper point I would take it that you would want to make, because that's going to play the sort of dialectical role that you want vis-a-vis sort of people trying to justify state. Okay.
Sorry, I missed part of that. You start saying providing a lot of benefits is something.
Oh, okay. Right. So I take it that you want the deeper point you want to make is that providing a lot of benefits is not going to justify coercion. Because I take to be that's the point you want to make against sort of the political authority proponent, right? Is they're like, yeah, here's what justifies political authority, is that the state provides a lot of benefits to people. Its coercion leaves people a lot better off. It seems like what they want, right? That's what it seems like what they want to say. And it seems like I took the point of that case to be like, you want to say no, right? Even if the state provides us with a lot of benefits, right, and does leave us better off, that still doesn't justify coercion.
Oh,
but then I'm worried you're sort of then going to lose your dialectical leverage against, like, I feel like you can then make the case, you're sort of stripping out your own Sneaku, like the relevance of your Sneaku case to your sort of dialectic with the statist.
Right. Actually, now I don't remember the context of that example and what point I was making. So there's another example. There's some people who are on a lifeboat. The lifeboat is taking on water. It's in danger of sinking. And for some reason, the other passengers are not bailing the boat. And then you pull out your gun and you force them to bail out the boat, which saves everyone. Okay. That is justified. Now, okay. And then, statists will try to use this as an analogy to the state, like the state has to prevent a complete breakdown of social order. And so they're allowed to do that. So I think the state is entitled to, like, in the lifeboat scenario, you are entitled to force the people to bail out the boat. And if government is actually necessary to maintain social order, then they are justified in doing what's necessary to maintain social order. Right. But I claim this doesn't lead to authority, because the idea of authority is that they get to, in addition, do stuff that isn't necessary, right, to maintain social order. Like, they get this content independent justification for making up rules and enforcing them. So, like, even when they're wrong, they still get to enforce their rules. Okay.
Right. Okay, good. But then I don't want to take us too far back, but then I feel like I'd be inclined to say the same thing about property, right? Which is I'd say, well, look, yeah, right, you can sort of keep somebody from, taking the food you need to survive, right? Anything that's sort of analogous to a lifeboat case that's like really sort of serious and life-saving and very important, then you can permissibly coerce people. But then you just don't get the same kind of content-independent discretionary control over resources, right? It seems like that wouldn't be justified, even if some benefit is provided by that, right? And, you still can't coerce people.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, when I was writing the political authority book, I wasn't really thinking in rule utilitarian terms. So
Right.
I would have to think, about, how that affects what I said in the book.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'd be interested to see how that piece fits in because I can't quite, figure it
Yeah.
out just sitting
But,
here.
like what's, for the property rights case, what immediately matters is not the results of me using my property in the way that I want right now, but the results of having the social rule that says that people get to use their property in the way that they want.
Right,
Okay.
and then the thought is maybe that sort of conformance with the rule is what justifies coercion, is what you maybe want to say.
Yes, right.
Yeah,
And then,
interesting.
with cases like this lifeboat, so there would be a exception to the rule against coercion that says something like, oh, but you do get to coerce people if you're like saving their lives or something. And then having that exception be part of the socially accepted morality would be overall socially beneficial.
Okay, good. Yeah, so I like that move. So I guess then maybe if that's the sort of line you'd want to push, then I do think that it seems like, right, our disagreement is in some sense deeper, right, where it's just like we have different views about what it is that sort of fixes rights. Like in some sense, like, yeah, kind of to go back to what I was suggesting earlier, like, you're sort of like, yeah, you have rights that are sort of downstream from, the utility maximizing rules, or the rules that maximize utility in the particular sense you've specified. And you're like, that's what fixes people's rights. And I'm sort of like, yeah, well, that probably gives you plausible answers in some cases. I'm not sure if it gives plausible cases in others, but I'm like, I think I would sort of give a different theory about what it is that matters, morally speaking, which isn't just utility maximization, but rather is sort of like, some hybrid of, maximizing utility, but also distributing it in a luck egalitarian fashion. And I'm kind of like, that's sort of what that's what governs permissible use of resources and the permissible coercive enforcement of uses. And so it seems like in some sense, yeah, like there's a degree of convergence there, but just a deeper disagreement about what it is that fixes those rights. And that might be sort of a harder thing to resolve. But I feel like maybe some of the cases we've been considering are actually maybe a little bit oblique given your sort of rule utilitarian view. Maybe.
Right.
Maybe how's that for a sum up?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Sounds good. Um, so do you have a generally rule consequentialist approach? Just not
I'm
utilitarian?
No, I'm not. Well, I
Yeah.
mean, your view is interesting. I'd have to think more about it, but I've always been a little bit sympathetic to sort of the act utilitarian critique of rule utilitarianism. That the best rule is act utilitarianism.
Right.
So I kind of have sort of more of like almost an act utilitarian, but tempered by egalitarian view is sort of how I think about things.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. 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 And so that would be a good objection to like a simpler version of
Right.
rule
Yeah, you've got a
utilitarian.
more sophisticated version that I'd have to think more about. I'm
So,
still.
by the
I'm
way,
not.
like
Yeah.
this is basically Richard Brandt's view, so I
Okay.
can't claim much originality.
Interesting. I'll have to check it out. But yeah, but it's interesting. I'll have to think more about it. I don't have immediate strong views one way or the other. Yeah. But anyway, this is interesting. Yeah, it's been a good discussion.